makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Marrakesh as we continue our special coverage from the IMF World Bank meetings in Morocco. Now, coming up on today's program, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in Tel Aviv, and President Biden issues a warning to Iran as Israeli troops amass near Gaza. Israel's defense minister vows to wipe out Hamas as the nation's new emergency government prepares for a possible ground offensive. Plus, we're live from the IMF World Bank meetings in Marrakesh with guests including the Belgian Central Bank Governor Pierre Wunsch and the European Commissioner for the Economy, Paolo Gentiloni. Now let's get a look at European markets map. I know we have some really good analysis on the Bloomberg terminal, and of course a piece which I find extremely important and also quite touching by our John authors. Now, shares for the moment advancing before a report that's expected to show a slowing in U.S. inflation, which will help the outlook for the Federal Reserve's next steps. The picture across the board for the moment, you can see gains across the board. I'm looking at some of the movers that are moving the most. I have Ericsson dropping after it said it expected a record of an impairment charge, and then EasyJet also falling after the airline said it will order an additional 157 Airbus SE A320neo jets. We're also getting IEA actually coming out with a report. Oil price is pulling back, they say, because it reflects demand destruction. Of course, the big story on oil is exactly what will happen if the conflict between Israel and Hamas spreads. We don't have any report on that yet. I know there's a number of banks trying to look at worst case and best case scenario. Certainly the IEA has not weighed in on that. Now, to the politics, and of course, let's get on the ground. We hear and we know that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has landed in Tel Aviv as Israeli troops amass near the Gaza border. At least 2,400 people on both sides, mostly civilians, have died in the conflict between Israel and Hamas so far. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook joins us now from Tel Aviv. So, Oliver, what's the latest on the ground?
That's right. So we have Blinken, who has just arrived here, and really, before he got on the plane, really sending us a message of support for Israel and the Israeli people and the government. Support that is really very much needed in Israel. Politically, yes, if they want to stage a ground invasion, but also militarily, right? There are 350,000 more soldiers active today than there were a week ago, particularly if things escalate in the north with the border of Lebanon and Hezbollah. They will need that equipment and also to replenish the Iron Dome. In terms of the last 12 or so hours, politically, we have that unity government declared and presided over by Benjamin Netanyahu, which really brings together also the opposition parties, bringing together what has been a very fragmented Israeli political situation until basically Saturday. And there have been continued strikes overnight in Gaza since Saturday. Their death toll there is at 1,200 people that we know so far. They've cut out from some food, water, and electricity. In terms of what we've heard from the Israel Defense Forces, we have heard that there are more than 300,000 members of ground troops that are amassing near Gaza, that they're making preparations, they say, for the next stage of war, which will come when the timing is opportune. We also heard from them that we do not have a decision yet from the political leadership on whether or not to invade Gaza, but the military is in a position to do so if that does happen. And remember, this is a war effort that will be infinitely complicated by the 2 million people living densely populated in Gaza, and of course by the number of hostages, which we don't have a full figure on, that were taken by Hamas over the weekend.
Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Crook there live in Tel Aviv. Now, the crisis, of course, in the Middle East is the big focus, the central focus here at the IMF World Bank meetings. With me now, Nouriel Roubini, Chairman and Chief Executive of Roubini Macro Associates. Nouriel, thank you. It's been a tough week for everyone, and it's extremely difficult to see where this ends and what it means for the global economy.
Yes, it's hard, and you have to think about scenarios. I would say the baseline scenario is one in which Israel occupies Gaza is going to get ugly, but the conflict remains contained to there. And therefore, the markets so far are essentially pricing this one as being the baseline. That's why oil prices have not gone very much, because there is not really a threat to the supply of oil in the Gulf. There was a little bit of a risk off with impacts on bond yields and on gold and so on. But even markets, equity markets have recovered because there are other economic views, like maybe the Fed staying on hold rather than hiking again, that are positive. But of course, there is a downside scenario in which as Israel tried to destroy Hamas. Iran, that is a major backer of Hamas, decides to unleash Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then you have a second front in Lebanon, maybe a third one in the West Bank. And at that point, Israel will have to attack Iran. If that were to be the case, of course, then the supply of oil from the Gulf gets, disrupted, and then you could have a spike in oil prices, and then the economic impact will be huge. I mean, in 73, we had the Yom Kippur War. In 79, we had the Iranian Revolution. There was an oil shock that then led to stagflation all over the world. But it's not the baseline scenario, but it's a risk.
But it's a risk. I don't know the probability of that risk, or whether we shouldn't even be talking about probabilities. Are we talking 10%, 30%, or do we just not know?
The honest answer, we don't know. Different people may have different assessment. I would say that certainly the baseline probably will be at least a 2/3 probability that the conflict remains contained to Gaza. Whether then it's a 20 or 30 or 35% probability of something escalating, the honest answer is nobody knows exactly. But the market seems to be discounting the possibility of a massive conflict throughout the Middle East for now.
But if oil goes to even 120 or 130, let's say, how problematic is that for central banks and the world economy?
Well, it's problematic in two ways, because higher oil prices implies that most economies go into a slowdown of growth or a recession, and then there's a rise in inflation. It's a stagflationary shock, and then becomes a huge dilemma for central banks, because either there's raise rates to try to fight that inflation, and then you have a more severe economic contraction, or if you decide that you care more about growth, and then you don't raise rates, then you have a de-anchoring of inflation expectation, like it happened in the 70s. So whenever you have a negative supply shock, this stagflationary then becomes a real dilemma for central banks, and we don't know how they're going to be answering to this shock.
It's also like there's just a global sadness, right? A lot of people are speaking out. I don't know whether this impacts spending.
I think that actually it impacts, first of all, business confidence, especially in Europe, where economic activity is effectively contracting, has been contracting for a number of quarters. I would say that if you are any business, there's an option value of waiting. If you have to decide how many more workers to hire, whether to do more capex. And there's been a slowdown, for example, in employment growth in the Eurozone so far. The economic contraction on the GDP production side has been more severe. So this could be actually a tipping point where firms decide, I have no idea whether this conflict is going to spread or not. Let me wait and see. I'm not going to hire anymore. I'm going to stop some of the capex. And that could become self-fulfilling and imply that the Eurozone is already borderline into recession. Same thing with the UK going to an actual recession. So even the probability of something bad happening affects through uncertainty decisions of the business sector and even of consumer. Consumer may slow down consumption as well.
Nouriel, how critical are the next couple of days or weeks? So if we have boots on the ground in Gaza from Israel, is this an escalation point that could actually happen quite quickly?
Well, I think that most people expect that Israel at this point has no choice but go into Gaza and get rid of Hamas forever. And they didn't do it in the past. It's going to be painful. It's going to be ugly.
Be a strong escalation, right?
It really an escalation, but I believe that the markets are already pricing in that Israel has no choice but going into Gaza. The question is going to be, once they go into Gaza, whether then skirmishes that are occurring in the north become more severe, whether Hezbollah in Israel start a real war, and therefore there'll be a hand of Iran directly in that happening, and then the conflict will become regional as opposed to being limited to Gaza. Then the markets are pricing in that something ugly is going to happen in Gaza, unfortunately, and there's no other choice. So they're not worried as much about that, but about whether there's going to be an escalation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's always a choice, but we'll leave the politics to one side. Nouriel, thank you. Nouriel Roubini, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Roubini Macro Associates. Coming up, concerns are mounting that the Israel-Hamas conflict could spill over across the region. We talked to Rami Mortada, the Lebanese Ambassador to the UK. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
Welcome back, and let's return to our top story, the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. Israel has also traded fire on the Lebanon border with Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah. There are concerns that Hezbollah could attack Israel if Tel Aviv moves to a full ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. Joining me now is Rami Mortada. He's the Lebanese ambassador to the UK. Rami, run us through then what you're hearing in terms of new intelligence. Do you expect this war to go deeper into Lebanon?
Well, good morning. I think it's all in the hands of the Israelis. From our side, we are fully mobilized to make sure that there is no spillover towards the Lebanese side of the borders. The situation is tense, as you can imagine, but it's relatively calm. From our side, we are fully committed to the terms of the cessation of hostilities that took place in 2006 and that has been reigning in since then. But since Saturday afternoon, we're sustaining Israeli provocation. So our will and our commitment to de-escalation needs to be met by the other side. And that's why international partners are called on to make sure that this takes place.
I mean, here's the thing, Rami. So Hezbollah has a major bloc in the Lebanese parliament. They are a designated terrorist group by the United States. What would the Lebanese government's position be if Hezbollah decides to go into an all-out confrontation with Israel?
Well, the Lebanese government has been fully mobilized immediately after the events on Saturday to make sure that calm and stability is maintained in South Lebanon. And any action from our side is purely of defensive nature and is purely destined at making sure that self-restraint prevails on both sides of the border. But at the same time, no country can stand idly when it's provoked and when its territories are attacked. That's why I said it takes two to de-escalate, and the other side should also self-restraint in order to maintain the calm and stability at the border.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like you're going to maintain a united front as a Lebanese government, and that includes Hezbollah. In terms of the Palestinian refugee camps, and there are quite a few in the south of Lebanon, could we see a flare-up in violence there?
Well, obviously, the social fabric in the entire region is similar. So when such a level of atrocities and violence are committed against the Palestinians, you would imagine that this tension would naturally propagate not only towards Lebanon, but throughout the region. So you would expect a high level of tension. And I think it's up to the Israelis to what extent they would take this deadly war instead of the tragedies we've been seeing since Saturday being a wake-up call towards reversing this race to the bottom and starting.
I mean, that's your view. That's your view, Rami. But in terms of what you can do today from your end, are you speaking to the British government here in London since the beginning of the week? What have those talks been like? Are you appealing for them to take a certain form of action?
We are in close consultations with all our international partners in order to pass the message that from our side, there is no will for escalation. At the same time, we will not stand by if our territory is attacked. And I think this is an obvious right for every state. So the message which should be passed is that self-restraint is necessary from all sides in order to maintain the peace and stability and allow the UN force in South Lebanon to pursue its mission, and the Lebanese army also in cooperation with the Lebanese army.
That was Rami Mortada at the Lebanese embassy here in the UK. Let's get you a bit of a snapshot of some of our other coverage in the pipeline. We'll get back to the IMF World Bank meetings. We're going to be speaking to Pierre Wunsch, the ECB Governing Council member and the Belgian Central Bank Governor. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to the IMF World Bank meetings here in Marrakesh, where the European economic outlook is a key focus. Now, with us now, Pierre Wunsch. He is the governor of the National Bank of Belgium and, of course, ECB Governing Council member. Thank you, Mr. Wunsch, for joining us. There's a lot to talk about. It's tricky, I imagine, setting at the moment forecasts for the economy, given all of the geopolitical uncertainty. What are you most worried about?
You know, we've had a succession of shocks, so uncertainty has been high for a while now. And of course, with what's taking place in the world right now, I think we have to live with that. But we have to recognize that uncertainty is not going to go away in the coming months.
Governor, there's also, of course, the spread widening between Italian bonds and a lot of other peers. What does that mean for how you set monetary policy?
Well, we are independent, and we are at least supposed to set monetary policy regardless of, the fiscal position. Sometimes we have interactions that are positive or less positive. But the situation is very clear. We have a number of countries in Europe, it's not only one, that have a deficit that is too high, and they have to work on bringing that deficit to a level that makes their debt sustainable.
What does it mean for PEP? So there have been a number of governors saying that actually that you should start talking about ending this sooner. Is that still possible?
I'm in favor of at least reopening the discussion. I understand that we have sort of committed to, keep reinvesting until the end of 24. But I don't think there is any strong rationale for doing that today, except that we have announced it. We have hiked for 150 basis points, so I think we should at least reopen the discussion.
But so I understand. Is it less likely that you can reopen the discussion about ending PEP earlier than has been announced because of the widening spread between Italian bonds and
let me put it this way. At some point, we are going to stop PEP reinvestment. So we need to think about a world where we are going to stop PEP reinvestment. And, I don't want to be in a situation where, stopping a bit before, a bit later makes a huge difference, because that would mean that we have a problem, and then we have probably to deal with this problem with the instruments that would allow for this problem to go away, or at least to be under control in a sustainable manner, and not depending on whether we do PEP reinvestment or not with a delay of so many months.
So what are you telling me, that widening spreads is not your problem? Is that how to put simply?
I'm telling you that I'm in favor of reopening the discussion. We have to be cautious, and when we use our instruments, but I'm still of the opinion that we should reopen the discussion.
Governor, are we near peak rates right now, and do you worry about the market seems to have stabilized somewhat in understanding what the ECB is trying to do? Is there something that actually they still struggle to assimilate?
No, I mean, I guess my answer on terminal rate would be maybe. If we reach terminal, I would say maybe, because what is comforting first is inflation is going down. That's important. It's going in the right direction. But also the numbers we've seen, especially for core in the last readings, have been in line with our forecast. It's been a while that it was not the case. So on the basis of that, I think the forecast can be used as sort of anchor. And if we keep seeing inflation numbers aligned with the forecast, then we don't have to hike anymore. Now, if we would see inflation going above what we have in the forecast, not marginally, but in any more or less significant way, then we would have to do more. So my answer is really maybe. And we have to recognize that the uncertainty on inflation has been, it's one of a kind. I mean, you can compare to the 70s, but there are many differences. So I think we also have to recognize the uncertainty, and that's why my answer is maybe instead of yes for sure.
But how much do you worry about oil prices? This is the big unknown because of what we're living through geopolitically.
I mean, it's one element. I mean, we have upside risk to inflation. We have downside risk to inflation. Obviously, we see that the tightening of monetary policy has had an impact on credit development, maybe even more than we thought. That's a downwards risk to inflation. And of course, higher oil prices are an upward risk. So we'll have to look at the balance of the two and keep looking at the numbers as they come.
Governor, when's the ideal time to really do QT?
Well, we have already stopped, some reinvestments, and again, I think it's more about the direction. We are in a tightening cycle, and that means that there are no strong rationales anymore for keeping reinvestment. It doesn't mean that I'm in favor of stopping, in any brutal way, but I would wish we can reopen the discussion and look at a timing that would be in line with the current situation.
Ideally in your mind, what time frame are you looking at?
I don't have any specific numbers or target. It's just, to me, it's more like a question of being consistent. Yeah. We are in a tightening mode, and then we are still reinvesting. Maybe it's good that we rediscuss, the issue.
Governor, thank you so much for joining us. That was Pierre Wunsch, the governor of the National Bank of Belgium and, of course, the ECB Governing Council member. Now, coming up, we'll also bring you the latest on the Israel-Hamas war as the conflict enters its 6th day. Then we speak to Mr. Gentiloni of the European Commission, and we also have a good roundup of everything that's being discussed here at the IMF World Bank meetings in Marrakesh. This is Bloomberg. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in Tel Aviv, and President Biden issues a warning to Iran as Israeli troops amass near Gaza. Israel's defense minister vows to wipe out Hamas as the nation's new emergency government prepares for a possible ground offensive. Plus, we're live for IMF World Bank meetings here in Marrakesh. In just a moment, we'll also be joined by the European Commissioner for the Economy, Paolo Gentiloni. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here with more special coverage around the IMF annual meetings in Marrakesh. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has landed in Tel Aviv amid continued escalation in the Israel-Hamas war. At least 2,400 people on both sides have died in the conflict so far. Now, the Palestinian permanent observer to the United Nations says there needs to be a humanitarian intervention to avoid a looming catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. Israel is preparing for a possible ground offensive in Gaza as the Prime Minister Netanyahu promises to destroy Hamas.
We are fighting with all our strength on all fronts. We went on the offensive. Every Hamas member is a dead man. Hamas is ISIS, and it will be crushed and eliminated just as the world crushed and eliminated ISIS.
Peace would require that the Israeli side to recognize that we exist and we are humans and we have national rights and aspirations. And these national rights and aspirations should be fulfilled, and there is global consensus on them. The two-state solutions and people to live in peace and harmony as good neighbors, which would require the end of occupation.
Well, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook joins us now from Tel Aviv. Ollie, so Antony Blinken has arrived. What can we actually expect from his visit?
That's right. He's just arrived in Tel Aviv, and he will spend several hours here. He will leave before the evening, though he will not spend the night here. And after that, he will head over to Jordan. And really, the message that he carried with him as he got onto the plane to come here to Israel was that that the United States has Israel's back, and that is really the political message that Israel needs, particularly if it wants to wage a ground invasion of Gaza. It needs the United States' political support, but it also needs the United States' military support. There are 300,000 more soldiers today active than there were a week ago, and that requires a lot of equipment, plus not to mention all of the Iron Dome and intercepting all the missiles. That also will need to be replenished. But we also understand that Antony Blinken intends to meet the Palestinian National Authority President Mahmoud Abbas as well tomorrow in Jordan, so some diplomacy also on the table.
What's the latest on the ground in Gaza?
Yeah, so we have the new unity government here in Israel, but in Gaza there have been strikes that have been going on overnight. They've really been unrelenting since Saturday. We understand the death toll in Gaza to be 1,200 people. Those are the latest figures that we have. And the electricity is cut off, the food, the water. So really a very dire situation in Gaza. In terms of next step, we understand that there are 300,000 ground troops that are stationed near Gaza that are ready to move. But we did hear from the defense forces saying that the political leadership has not yet decided on a ground invasion in Gaza, though it is widely anticipated, and the military is prepared to do so if indeed they decide to. But it's a war effort, Francine, that will be intensely complicated by the 2 million people living in very dense population within Gaza, and of course the hostages that Hamas is still holding.
Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Crook there joining us from Tel Aviv. Now joining us here from Marrakesh at the World Bank IMF meetings, Christian Keller, Barclays Head of Economics Research. Christian, thank you for joining us. A horrific week on a human level that we absolutely must always remember. You go through the corridors here at the IMF World Bank meetings, and people are whispering about worst-case scenarios. They're hoping for the best, but it's unclear actually what this means for escalation and what this means for central banks and the economy.
I think markets intuitively try to look through these episodes of geopolitical volatility, as tragic as they may be, as you alluded to. I mean, Obviously, that was wrong on Ukraine already. I think the initial market reaction was also, we've seen this before, and markets just look at history, and typically those are sell-offs that then later reverse. Now, we've seen it didn't work in Ukraine, and this also looks something that has just started in the sense you just talked to your correspondent in Tel Aviv, where now Israel is preparing to go into Gaza. I mean, there's once is general risk sentiment it could affect, but then importantly also the price of oil. I mean, we've seen some reaction so far, but markets are nervous but have not overreacted, I would say. But of course, there's a lot of stake. You mentioned Iran. Yeah. You mentioned Iran has been an important supplier to the market, more important than in earlier. And these things could turn around, and then we may have oil prices again higher. And that has implications for the global economy.
Because the implications are so big, and I guess the worst case scenario could be so bad, do you expect business confidence to take a hit?
Not for now. I think business is careful not to overreact. They will wait for now. I mean, as horrible as atrocities are, it is something that could be contained in the region. As I said, the global element here is really the oil price, and of course that would affect everyone. But I think so far the market will continue to not to anticipate too much. But of course, as you say, I mean, the implications are big. This is something that, for Israel is the biggest thing that happened in 70, 80 years, and so. I think we have to really wait and see.
Yeah, and you're right. We just don't know actually what happens next, if there's escalation or if we just don't know at the moment. When you look at central banks around the world, so this could be the Fed, but also ECB, have we reached peak interest rates?
Well, it certainly looks like it. And, we still think that the U.S. may do another hike. We get some data today on the CPI. But overall, it is clearly, it seems quite clear that the core central banks have now reached the peak, except for the Bank of Japan. There's the one big exception. And now the question is, of course, will they really stick to the mantra higher for longer?
Yes.
It's convenient now. They want to indicate to the market not to price out or price in the early cuts. But of course, markets also know that central banks don't always have to be time consistent on this, that when the time comes, in first half of 24, depending how inflation and how growth looks like, central banks may still change their mind. I think this is why markets are not fully pricing the higher for longer as much maybe as central banks would like it.
But do you worry that, again, interest rates at 5% for a protracted time, even 6 months, could actually end up breaking a lot of things?
Well, I think certainly this has been a synchronized global hiking cycle. It was a Fed, but everyone else. And we've moved interest rates from zero or sometimes negative to what seems to be now restricted levels. And you keep that should have a big impact. And, we see it in the real estate sector. There's a lot of talk about what remains in terms of risks, in particular in commercial real estate, but also even generally housing, not so much in the US, but in Europe. So the impact is there. The global credit cycle has turned. And now the question is, and not to overuse that word, but will it be soft?
Yes.
Or will there be cracks? And almost certainly there will be some cracks, but it seems they won't be systemic. And I think we're on that side as well.
But how did people that were expecting a recession in the U.S., why did they get it so wrong, a hard recession?
That's a good question. And I think it first has to do with housing. A lot of people thought housing would be much harder hit. Much more unemployment one would have expected. It didn't happen. Particular reasons, the 30-year mortgages, a lock-in effect, the fact that there's no activity on the secondary market. And then how well the economy held up. So there was still demand for, from people who wanted to buy houses. The labor market is surprisingly strong. So I think these are reasons why the usual models didn't work. All those excess savings that are still in the system. So the fiscal impact that was, the impulse that was given during the pandemic is still working.
But Christian, do you worry that actually some of the models looking at inflation are not working going forward? So we had this warning from the IMF on Monday saying that they're expecting inflation to come back up. But I mean, that would be a big surprise to not only markets, but central banks.
That would be certainly a big surprise. And I think there are two risks here. The one, as we talked about already, is oil. Yep. Because so far we had nice negative year-on-year effects from oil prices. That will turn, if oil, let's say, goes to 100 or so, you start having that reverse. Now, central banks would tell you they look through this if it's a supply shock one-off. But of course, if that starts to feed into core inflation, I think this is what the IMF has pointed out, that's an issue. And then, and I think this is still very, very important for central banks, is the labor market. I mean, the US labor market data has been massively stronger than people expected. You know, this labor market is still creating 200,000-300,000 jobs a month, when people thought this would be a lot less. So we are very far away. Even what I think Paul said, 100,000 a month would be kind of the neutral. And so, you know, I think this is something that is very key. That's why we watch the data, you know, the outcomes in inflation, the wage growth, etc. And even for Europe, you know, the labor market remains key, I think, for central bankers. And that could possibly lead to even further tightening if things don't evolve as they have in the last few months, where inflation has been really nicely coming down.
Tristan, thank you so much for all of your insight. Christian Keller there, the Barclays head of economic research, joining us here from Marrakesh at the IMF World Bank meetings. Now, coming up, we'll speak to Paolo Gentiloni. He's a European Commissioner for the Economy. That's, again, live here from Morocco. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Now, this week, the IMF lifted its global inflation forecast for next year and called for central banks to keep policy tight until there's a durable easing in price pressures. Now, the IMF reckons that inflation will be 5.8% next year, with cuts made to its forecast for economic growth. Well, I'm very pleased to be joined by Paolo Gentiloni. He's the EU Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs. Commissioner, thank you for joining us. I mean, there's a lot going on, especially this week as we try and figure out what geopolitics could mean for Europe, for the price of oil, and of course, for the economy. Where are we right now?
Well, of course, we are, first of all, under the impact of the new war, the terrorist attack against Israel, not yet measuring fully the economic impact. Of course, there is a human impact, a geopolitical impact that could affect trade at global level. We don't see major impact in oil prices for the moment, but this is, of course, increasing the uncertainty of the economic perspective. For the rest, as far as Europe is concerned, we have a weak economy, but we are not in recession. And this is mixed news. It's, of course, bad news to have a weak economy, but if we think to what we were expecting 1 year ago, we were expecting a worse situation than the one we are in.
But, Commissioner, do you worry that if there's an escalation actually in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, this hurts business confidence, this hurts consumer confidence, and it puts Europe in a much more precarious position?
Sure, this is the impact of conflicts. We hope that escalation will not be there. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we know that Israel has to defend itself. And it's too soon to measure economically. Of course, we are here very near to where the crisis is going on, and we all feel this impact. But to measure it economically is honestly too soon.
Commissioner, talk to me a little bit about how inflation you think will behave. So we had this warning from the IMF. There could be a kind of a false trend going downwards with then a little bit of a lift that may happen even if oil prices, stabilize.
Yes, this is possible. In Europe, we had good news on inflation. In September, inflation was at 4.3%. Impressive decline. Just to remember that inflation 1 year before was double digit in the EU. So will this trend of decline continue at the same speed? Our estimates are not negative. But of course, this doesn't mean that we should declare victory on inflation. This means that we still need prudent fiscal policies because the problem is not solved, mm-hmm. and the risk of oil prices that for the moment is not materializing, but you can't exclude it.
Yeah. Commissioner, we also see a widening spread between Italian bonds and other European bonds. Do you worry about a fragmentation? Again, Italy being in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons.
Well, the level of this spread is at the moment not at all matter of concern. I think that we have increasing interest rates all over the euro area. So the spreads that we Italians know very well, because we follow the spreads, are not in particular matter of concern. What is important, I think, for all European member states is to keep prudent fiscal policies, because we can't, if we have monetary tightening, we can't undermine monetary tightening with expansive fiscal policies. And we have different tools to support investments and growth. At least until 2026, we had this extraordinary common funding. So the message is prudent fiscal policies and using of the common funding to support investment and the economy.
So one of the people that participants here at the IMF World Bank meetings are most excited to meet is the new PBOC governor, because it's his first travel abroad since being appointed. How should Europe actually deal with China economically?
Well, I think we grow up in recent 2 or 3 years after a period of a little bit of optimism in relation with China. We were thinking that trade relation with China in itself would have evolved in the positive way, a better level playing field among the European Union and China, etc. And we saw that this is not automatically the case. So I think we grew up, and now we are more demanding in our trade relations, less optimistic. But this doesn't mean at all that we figure to decouple with China. This is something completely impossible, not only wrong, but things impossible are worse than wrong. They are impossible. So there is a connection of the economy. We have to reduce risks in our supply chains and compete with China. But we shouldn't close.
But do you think we've seen a deglobalization, or certainly some of the trade scenarios getting less close and kind of pulled apart? Does this continue in full force?
Well, I've seen the recent data of the Kiel Institute, which is measuring the trade. And trade is in September in a stable condition after several months of decline. This is connected probably to the partial reopening of the Chinese economy, not so strong as expected, but it is going. And the level of trade, of course, is affected by a reduction of globalization, but at a certain extent. So I think we should be now ready for a long period where supply chains are more secure, trade is more competitive, but this is not deglobalization. This is not decoupling. It's the new form of globalization.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gentiloni, as always. That was Paolo Gentiloni, the EU Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more from Marrakesh. Also, the ruble surging after the Kremlin reimposes some capital controls. But is it enough to stabilize the currency in the long term? We'll have full analysis next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Now, Russia's currency could have its best day in a month after the government imposed some capital controls on the ruble. This comes as the Kremlin looks to reverse the third biggest depreciation in emerging markets this year. Well, Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson now joins us from London. Ros, good morning. So how effective will these controls be in steadying the ruble?
Well, as you can see, we're seeing a reaction. The ruble today having one of its better days in quite a while, but it's down really significantly across the year, one of the weakest currencies in the emerging market space that we've seen. And now we've seen the decision to essentially reimpose some of the controls that were put in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That compels the big companies to sell the earnings from their foreign sales back into the local market. That's to try and increase liquidity. Of course, we've seen the currency caught between competing things. We've got inflation, we've got cost of living pressures, we've got exporters squeezed, we've got demand for hard currency, and a lot of arrows being sort of thrown at the market to try and fix it. What we're hearing from Bloomberg Economics really is the view that this will possibly put a short-term floor under the currency. We've seen that knee-jerk reaction in the ruble today, but in the longer term, what you're talking about is a forex market that is fundamentally illiquid, very, very shallow, and in some ways dysfunctional. And just sort of moves like this in the short term might have that impact, but in the longer term, there are deep structural problems in that market that this will fail to address.
So, Ros, what does it tell us about the divisions that we have seen actually between the central bank and the finance ministry in Russia?
Well, it's interesting because the central bank has raised rates several times in recent months, sort of trying to put, again, a floor under the currency. And given those difficulties in the market, those interest rate increases have had no effect on the ruble. It's been a one-way move and it's all been down since then. And what we know is that the finance ministry was pushing for the reimposition of capital controls some months ago and got strong pushback from the central bank, which was saying, like, we just want to use interest rates now as our mechanism. So there was that disagreement at the time. What's happened in between, it's hard to know. Is there now full agreement between the central bank and the finance ministry that these are measures that are necessary? Did the finance ministry just say, you know what, we have to do this no matter what? It's very hard to know because there have been these periodic disagreements between the finance ministry, essentially the government and the Kremlin, and the central bank about the best ways to tackle the challenges in the Russian economy and on the ruble since the invasion of Ukraine. But certainly it seems that in this salvo, at least, the finance ministry has won the day.
Ros, thanks so much. Rosalind Matheson there with the very latest on the ruble. Now, we'll have plenty more throughout the day here from the IMF World Bank meetings in Marrakesh. Two interviews, exclusive interviews that we want to tell you about. Anna Botin, the Banco Santander Executive Chair, that's at 11 a.m. London time. And then Bill Winters, also of Standard Chartered, Chief Executive. That's a little bit later on. So we'll have full analysis on the banking system as well from Marrakesh. This is Bloomberg.